Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Erica Sigurdsson, and welcome back to the channel, Making History. Today I want to circle back to a topic from my first video on this channel, where we looked at why medieval films look so dark. So what I want to talk about today is something medieval historians call medievalism. So what is medievalism? So medievalism is a word that we use to talk about any post-medieval use or recreation of the Middle Ages. So arguably all medieval history is medievalism. But we more commonly use it to talk about the Middle Ages in pop culture. Things like movies, fantasy settings, video games, Disney logo, that sort of thing. Now, I want to be clear. Of course we recreate other historical time periods too. How many period films are there of Regency England? I'm a believer actually that historians of other time periods should get their own version of medievalism. But there is a good reason why medieval history got there early. The ways that we, meaning the present day, use the concept of the Middle Ages is so, specific. It's even in the word, right? The Middle Ages. That time between the excellent, very good classical world and the excellent, very good Renaissance, rediscovery of the classical world in the early modern era. It's BS. So medievalists are very aware of the power and negative impact of these, generalizations and popular ideas about our little corner of history. And we tend to feel a stronger need to defend ourselves, generally much more so than other historians, certainly more than any other historians of European or what we call Western history. And you know what they say? The best defense is a thorough critical analysis? Only in academia. So there are two main strands of medievalism in the modern world. The first is what I've been calling the Grimdark Middle Ages, but I guess would be more commonly known as kind of a Dark Ages view of the Middle Ages. So this is a vision of this period that first came out of Enlightenment ideas, where Enlightenment thinkers wanted to use the Middle Ages as a clear contrast to themselves. So this Grimdark Middle Ages is a vision of that period that is barbaric, superstitious, ignorant, irrational, all the things that they aren't. It's a time of progress stifled by repressive institutions, especially in areas like science, politics, or economics. It's hard for me to do anything particularly sophisticated with it because it annoys me so much. But for you guys, I'll see what I can do. Let me know in the comments if you'd watch that. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos. But for today, I'd much rather dive into the second kind of medievalism, romantic medievalism. So if you're trying to identify a romantic medievalism, some common tropes or themes to look out for include knights, castles, jousting, rescuing princesses from dragons, chivalry, nostalgia for a time when men were men and held doors on dates, a vision of unspoiled nature, and maybe a vision of ruined castles or monasteries and ghost stories. In general, romantic medievalisms tend to be either wholly or partially positive about the Middle Ages. They tend to include a fair amount of nostalgia, often a critique of modernity, and frequently pull together ideas of a simpler life, country living, being one with nature. They tend to be conservative about gender roles, but in a way that emphasizes men needing to protect and be polite to women, unlike the Grimdark version, which tends to emphasize brutal violence and overt misogyny. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Romanticism generally. So the Romantic movement was an early 19th century backlash to an increasingly dogmatic focus on reason and logic and science and that so-called Enlightenment or Age of Reason of the earlier 18th century. So Romantic thinkers, artists, poets, that sort of thing, generally felt that this emphasis on reason and science was missing something. It was missing an ability to appreciate beauty, to appreciate emotionality, and especially it was missing a vision of the sublime. So the sublime is kind of hard to explain, but personally I would describe it as the feeling you get standing at the foot of a really big waterfall. It's beautiful, it's terrifying, it reminds you of how small and insignificant you are, but not in a bad way, in an almost life-affirming way. The sublime aims at that feeling that Romantics called the elevation of the soul, and they liked medieval stuff for that. So partly this was a reaction to earlier Enlightenment ideology. The Enlightenment science bros engineered a vision of the Middle Ages that acted as a kind of dark mirror, right? This ugly opposite to everything they wanted to be. They were rational, so the Middle Ages were irrational. They were science and logic and democracy, so the Middle Ages were tyranny and superstition and emotion. So the Romantics didn't dispute any of that. They just liked it. They turned superstition into ancient customs and ritual. They turned tyranny into noble kings and ladies. Irrational is just the sublime. And emotional, well, they liked emotional. Doesn't need a rebrand. So the real heyday of Romantic medievalism was in the mid to late 19th century, especially in Britain, though you see it in other places too. In literature, this was first expressed through a craze starting in the mid 18th century for Gothic romances. I like Gothic romances. The word Gothic has this complicated history, but in this case, it's meant to invoke the Middle Ages and this kind of like spookiness of, say, Gothic cathedrals, Gothic architecture. Gothic romances are amazing, and they're kind of a precursor to modern horror genres. They pull in that idea of the sublime in kind of more of a pop culture sort of way. They imagine the Gothic, the medieval, as being spooky and scary, but in a fun way, an attractive way. The heroine will explore this scary old ruined abbey and is terrifying and full of maybe ghosts or something, the specter of ancient terrors, but you're meant to like it. It's fun. And Romantic medievalism went way past novels as well. So there was a fashion in buildings, a style called neo-Gothic, which were buildings made to look like medieval Gothic, cathedrals and castles and so on. And you can find these pseudo-medieval buildings in all kinds of weird places. Think of the Disney Castle, which supposedly was inspired by this amazing pseudo-castle in Bavaria called Neuschwanstein, built I think in the early 20th century, maybe late 19th. Now I'm Canadian, and here in Canada, our federal parliament buildings are also built in this neo-Gothic style. So I actually went to Ottawa a few months ago, and I was super disappointed because I didn't even get to see much of the neo-Gothic buildings because they're being repaired. But I did get to buy this. I don't know how much you can see, but it's like a little lion, I guess, like a little pseudo-medieval lion figure. It's just interesting, isn't it? Because in Canada, we never had a Gothic period in architecture, right? That we would go for this neo-Gothic style in our government buildings. But it's not just buildings. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you a story about this one guy from the mid-19th century named Lord Eglinton. So Lord Eglinton was a conservative politician and obsessed with the Romantic Middle Ages. And so in 1839, he hosted a medieval-style tournament on his property. So the whole story is fantastic. It was a whole debacle. He was not well prepared. And I'm going to link an article that talks in more detail about the whole thing. But a couple details that I think highlight this approach and vision of the Middle Ages. So firstly, several rich aristocrats of the time joined and they wanted to be part of the actual jousting. And they gave themselves mysterious knightly names like the Knight of the Dragon and the Knight of the Black Lion. You can see how they were being influenced by the more romantic pieces of the Middle Ages, like King Arthur stories and chivalry and all that. But none of them had any real experience with jousting, and the horses weren't used to it, and none of them could really do it properly. And the story is that only Eglinton managed to even land a hit, and is telling about the limitation of romance, right? Or of romantic fantasies about the past or another culture. Now that's not to say that the reverse, the grimdark version of the past, the Dark Ages, is more accurate or more truthful, because it's not. The Middle Ages, the past generally, is neither all bad, all wars and pestilence and murders, nor is it all high fantasy, milady, kiss the hand, romance and beauty. Both are wrong. Both are fantasies. And both of them say more about the present, about the person having that fantasy, than they do about the actual past. So now I want to dive in to two directions that Romantic medievalism can go. First, I'm going to talk about Romantic nationalism, and then I'm going to talk about some neo-peasants. First, we're going to talk about the medieval roots of nations. Broadly speaking, starting in the mid-19th century, historians and politicians, nationalists, started to argue for a medieval origin of the nation-state. Specifically, they believed that in the breakup of the Roman Empire, various Germanic tribes, like the Goths and Visigoths and the Franks and whatever, moved into this Europe left behind by the fallen Romans. Rome had fallen, no more Rome. And these different tribes, as they moved around and settled, the basis of various modern European nations and ethnic groups. That's not true. This narrative has been pretty thoroughly debunked and discussed by historians over the past several decades. Actually, I'll just check with you. Is it several decades or is it more like 50 years? Several decades. I have an expert in this time period, by the way. But we're not interested in the facts. Not for today, anyway. We're interested in what this idea was doing. And what it was doing was legitimizing state power. Right? It was creating this shared origin story to create a shared sense of national identity so that citizens would be more likely to support the state. So in England, this means like Anglo-Saxons. In France, this meant the Franks and the Gauls. We get the term French from Franks and Gallic from the Gauls. I'm going to try my best to do a Gallic shrug. Is that a Gallic shrug? I don't know. And like, of course, the Anglo-Saxons and the Franks and the Gauls existed, but this idea that they perfectly corresponded to modern national borders and modern national identities is, of course, incorrect. Or, at best half true, or a very little bit true. But there's a second, usually unspoken part to this medievalist ethnic nationalism. And that's the idea that this medieval heritage means something. Like, it's more than just trivia, this idea that these nations supposedly originated in the Middle Ages. In this nationalist understanding, it does have meaning. And not only does it have meaning, it somehow legitimizes and strengthens the nation. It doesn't make a lot of sense. I don't know, it's kind of like that relative who's very into like doing their family tree. Like, cool. I guess Ancestry.com says that the entire nation's descended from Charlemagne or whatever. But like, why would that matter? It's a weird move, right? But we can see that nationalism and national identity is very much a romantic idea, just all on its own. It's not based in like logic or realpolitik, at least not at the level of the citizen, right? It's emotion. It's created out of symbolism and ritual, things like flags and holidays. And the nation state, and especially what we call romantic nationalism, is largely a 19th century creation. And we've already seen how much the Romantics liked the Middle Ages. They liked that vibe. So it's not surprising that Romantic nationalists liked the idea of a medieval root for their modern nation states. And we're mostly talking about European nations and the European Middle Ages. But remember the Canadian Parliament buildings? We settler nations also had our uses for this medieval nationhood myth. And the power of this idea was so strong, and the desire to create a singular national identity was actually a very destructive force in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So in the year 1900, probably only around 50% of people living in France spoke French as their first language. The rest spoke what we now insist are dialects, regional dialects, Occitan or Provençal in the south of France, Breton in Brittany, some other ones that I don't know the names of. The French government went on a campaign to educate those cultural minorities, trying to eradicate these regional languages, eradicate their cultural markers, eradicate their sense of identity as distinct groups, because it didn't align with the Frank or Gaul origin myth of the ruling classes. In Britain, we saw similar, very brutal efforts in some cases to eliminate minority languages like Welsh and Irish and Scots. And even here in formerly British Canada, this is the time of our very ugly history of residential schools, which had as their goals to eliminate Indigenous languages and cultures. Now, I want to be clear that the residential school system isn't exactly the same. It's not exactly analogous to those other examples. It definitely had extra layers of abuse and racism. It's not a perfect comparison, but I do think it's worth bringing up in this context. Okay, so we've talked now about the darker side of Romantic nationalism, the real-life consequences for people whose lived identities didn't serve this myth of the origin of nations. I want to go a little lighter now and talk about some of the age-old traditions that were made up in the mid-19th century in service of this myth of ethnic nationalism, medieval style. So there were lots of people in the 19th century very interested in rediscovering the folk traditions and ancient customs and beliefs of the people. I don't know if you remember my saying way back at the start of this video how Romanticism and Romantic medievalism were very into this idealized country life or rural life. Yeah, this is that. And so in the mid to late 19th century, you got a lot of elite, university-educated, city or university-living academics who got very into peasants. They got very into folklore. Folklore, in many ways, just means the crap that farmers say. They turned that into a whole entire university discipline, folklore studies. The study of stuff that farmers say. I love the image of this. Like, imagine all these bearded academics in suits rocking up in some farming community and very seriously inquiring and asking the rustic rural folks to tell them all their stories and like their customs and their jokes and their nursery rhymes and what do you do at Christmas. And then very seriously writing it all down. So this is where we get a lot of our ideas of folk culture. I don't know, have you ever been forced to watch children do like traditional dances and traditional folk garb? Here where I live, you get a lot of Ukrainian folk dancers or Irish folk dancers. Now, my family's Icelandic, and in Manitoba, where a lot of the Icelanders are, there's a yearly tradition of naming a fjallkona, meaning a maid of the mountains. So she has to wear this outfit and be in a parade. It's folk tradition. Now, it's overstating the case to say that these 19th century scholars invented all these traditions and folktales, though I will say almost everything about the fjallkona is 100% made up in 1924. But in other cases, they definitely were, massaging the data. And we don't always know which parts are from the sources and which parts were added or changed by the academics themselves. And it's really hard to say for sure that something is truly ancient just because it's a tradition. I've seen this for myself, just with my own kids. Do something for 2 years running. Boom! It's a family tradition. And because the folklore academics came in and codified these traditions, they would publish books, like books of fairy tales or folk songs or folk tales or whatever. And then that makes those traditions a lot more static, a lot less fluid. It's harder to be fluid and adapt traditions to the modern day because they're written down somewhere. Ukrainian dancing is now this very specific thing, and you have to wear the outfit, even though nowadays people don't dress like that and you feel kind of silly. It's tradition. So we've looked at some ways that the Middle Ages can be used or interpreted for nationalist goals. But here on YouTube, there's another interesting use of the past. Not always the Middle Ages, but close enough that I still want to talk about it. So like a lot of people, I was briefly very interested in YouTube channels featuring gardening, permaculture, and that sort of cottagecore aesthetic, that was so big early in the pandemic. I feel like I've got a bit of that going on today. One piece of that is the lifestyle of people who will buy a piece of land, retreat from civilization, and try to live as self-sufficiently as possible, raising goats and making your own soap, that sort of thing. Here in North America, this lifestyle is most commonly called homesteading. But in much of Europe and Australia, I've heard it as well, they often will call themselves neo-peasants. Now, if you're a medievalist, I bet I can guess exactly the face you just made at that. There's a strong element of this rural nostalgia in the movement, that important element of Romanticism. And the movement's been criticized fairly, I think, for romanticizing farm life, minimizing the hard work and the grind. And I think it has a lot of other flaws common to many other romantic lifestyle movements. Not all neo-peasants are anti-vaxxers, but some are. And they tend to believe in the healthfulness of homegrown food and herbal remedies in a way that, in my opinion, can sometimes tip into ableism, into either invisibilizing people with disabilities or insisting that they can all be cured by some good old-fashioned hard physical labor and cutting out processed foods. I don't love that. Now, I want to be clear. I like this stuff. In spite of all that criticism, which I also believe in, sometimes I want to ferment things. And really, I like the way these communities force us to reevaluate some of our closely held assumptions about economy and rural lifestyles. Now, that being said, I still want to firmly locate this movement in the realm of romantic medievalism. I want to let this guy explain it to you.
Let's just maybe start with our ancestors, our peasant ancestors from various parts of Europe.
And the Middle East.
In the Middle East. Peoples who many holidays, seasonal holidays to celebrate together on common land, usually where the festivals took place was on the commons. Peasants had throughout, particularly through up until the Middle Ages, had lots of different rites, rites of passage and rites of spring and rites of harvest. And so this was all celebrated with dance and song and homemade alcohols.
So this guy's vision of peasants. Now, I think he said pre-Middle Ages, actually, but I'm here to tell you that anything he thinks he knows about pre-medieval peasants has been filtered through medieval Christian sources and or classical sources. But anyway, doesn't matter. His take on peasants is it's very complicated. So for today, I just want to say that this vision of neo-peasantry as getting drunk and dancing around in the village commons during one of your many holidays, well, it feels very similar to me to that romantic nationalist exercise of collecting folktales and peasant dishes to turn into a national identity. There's probably some truth in his vision of peasant life, but it's like trying to pick out the real medieval elements of the Disney castle. And truth isn't really the point, I don't think. It's not really about this careful historical analysis of pre-medieval peasant culture. It's about creating a justification of this guy's vision for his own lifestyle, wanting to create an origin myth, just like the myth of the origin of European nations, and rooting that in the early Middle Ages. Now, I actually do like their insistence on viewing peasants through a positive lens. One thing that this neo-peasant movement does that I appreciate is their focus on reevaluating the idea of subsistence living. Because I hear that phrase and it sounds terrifying. It sounds like being one bad harvest away from dying of starvation. And it can be that. But maybe that's itself kind of a liberal, grimdark view of rural agricultural life. I mean, that did happen sometimes. There were famines in the Middle Ages, but plenty of times agricultural life was probably fine. So I don't fully buy this romantic vision of being a peasant or neo-peasant. I'm not totally convinced that it was all bacchanalia and multi-day home-fueled ragers in the village commons. But it's made me think about my own bias as a modern, urban, 21st century person, and I'd be interested to dig a little deeper, see what truth there might be in this more romantic vision of peasant life. In a very good article about neo-peasants in France, this person talks about how this neo-peasant ideology is neither strictly oriented towards the past nor strictly towards the future. They're inspired by the past, but the alternate way of life they're proposing and living, they're proposing it as a solution to the very real, very serious ecological problems of the present. This movement is in response to the ecological crisis, overconsumption, oppression under capitalism. You don't have to agree with the solution or accept it wholesale, but it is, I think, an interesting and thought-provoking response to some very serious present-day issues. And they're drawing on past knowledge to do that. I think that's cool. This is how I want to see people interacting with history. Okay, time for a recap. So medievalism is the modern use of or recreation of the Middle Ages. And we do it a lot. And it tends to take two forms. Remember? First, the Grimdark medievalism imagines a Middle Ages that is brutal and dirty and horrible. It's a kind of othering the past and believing yourself superior to it. The trickier medievalism, in a way, is the second kind of medievalism, the one I've spent the most time talking about today. Romantic medievalism is like a kinder, softer approach. It's more positive, but it's still not a genuine attempt to see the Middle Ages and engage with actual historical reality on its own terms. Romantic medievalism still has its agendas. Sometimes that agenda is nationalist, part of a project of this national myth-making. Other times that agenda is naturalist, I guess we could say, wanting to mythologize and romanticize peasant life, folk tradition, all that kind of stuff. It's using the past to justify a present-day preference or to critique present-day problems. I don't know. I mean, that might be okay. There's nothing wrong with learning from history, but there's always this risk. When we want to use the past to speak on a present-day issue or project, there's always a temptation to skate over the details that don't serve your purpose. And at some point, if we keep doing that, it becomes dishonest. It becomes bad history. So anytime we're tempted to use history for present-day purposes, personally, I think best practice is to work very carefully, be very accurate, notice our bias, and please just be very, very tentative in our conclusions. That's enough for today. It's a lot to think about, I think. So take care, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you next week. Take care, bye-bye.